In this video, let me explain how to remortgage to buy a second property, which can be a great way to fund your first UK property investment deal. I want to give you the exact steps on how to remortgage because it's really important that you go through the remortgage process in the right order, or frankly, your application could get rejected. Hi, my name's Tony Law, and just before we dive in, I just need to say really quickly that this is for educational purposes only, and you should not consider this financial advice, so please speak to your FCA-regulated advisor if this is something that you're considering. So, now we've got that out of the way, just to cover the basics. Remortgaging means taking out a new mortgage on a property that you already own, and usually it's going to be the one that you're living in, but it could just as easily be an investment property. And you then receive a lump sum of money from the lender, which is then secured against the property. But why would anyone want to do this? Well, the main reason is, of course, to access any equity that might be locked inside the property. And just to clear up a common misconception here, no, you don't have to use that money to buy another property. You can actually use those funds for anything you want. You could, for example, use that money to refurbish other properties or to consolidate debt or invest in a new business or a new venture. Or, of course, hopefully to buy another buy-to-let property. And so let's quickly run through an example of how this works. If you had a property and you were going to remortgage and pull out, say, £50,000 at an interest rate of, say, 5%, you'd be paying £2,500 a year in interest on that £50,000, wouldn't you? Because 5% of £50,000 is £2,500, which, if my calculations are correct, is around about £208 per month. And in this scenario, don't forget, you're just going to be paying the interest on the loan. You're not paying back any of the original £50,000. Or to put it another way, if the interest rate doesn't change for, say, 10 years, at the end of 10 years, you would have paid £2,500 times 10, which is obviously 25 grand, but you would still owe the original £50,000. Does that make sense? And so whilst this money obviously isn't free, it's also not classed as income. It's actually debt, which means it's not taxed. And of course, that's a huge advantage, especially if you happen to be a higher rate taxpayer. And by that, I mean, if you sold that property, instead of trying to access the same £50,000 from the proceeds of the sale, you might have to pay capital gains tax. Also, because that property is then sold, you're not going to benefit from any uplift in value over the years, are you? And if it was an investment property, no more rental income. By the way, as a quick aside here, I've made this mistake myself. In fact, I've made it on 2 separate occasions, but thinking of one in particular, in order to fund a specific deal a few years back, I think it was about 8 years to be exact, I needed some cash. And so rather than remortgaging one of my investment properties, I decided to sell it. It was the one that I had in Wales, and I just thought, well, I'll just sell it. Just before I started filming this video, I worked out that if I'd have kept that property and just remortgaged it, which I could have, I would have made an additional £57,600 before tax in rental income. And I guess that property would be worth maybe an additional £60,000 today, give or take. Now, once again, I have to remind you that none of this is financial advice. I'm just sharing what I did or what I consider to be the mistake that I made. You obviously need to make your own decisions, but I know what I'd do if I could go back in time and do that again. Anyway, so I guess the next question is that you may have is, how much can you actually borrow against a property? And this is where loan to value, or LTV, comes into play. Most lenders will let you borrow up to 75% of the property's current value for a standard buy-to-let. So if your property is worth, say, 200 grand, you could potentially borrow up to £150,000, couldn't you? But if it's not just about the value of the property. The lender will also want to see something called rental coverage. This usually means that the rent needs to be at least 125% of the mortgage payments, but in some instances, this can actually go up to 145%. I know this sounds overly complicated, so let me give you a quick example here. If the mortgage is going to cost you £1,000 a month at, say, a 5 or 6% interest rate, the property needs to generate a rental income of at least £1,250 if the rental coverage is 125% for the lender to actually be happy to lend or remortgage to you at all. In fact, let me give you a real world example here. Let's say that you bought a property 3 years ago for £150,000 that in today's market is maybe worth £190,000. And when you originally bought it 3 years ago, you took out a mortgage of £110,000. Well, that means, based on a 75% loan to value, that you could now borrow £142,500 on that property, that being 75%. If you subtract £110,000 mortgage that you've currently got from the 142,500, well, that gives you access to £32,500 in equity. That's the money that you can potentially pull out and put to work hard in another investment. But what if you own a property outright with no mortgage and it's worth, say, £200,000? Well, if you remortgage this at 75% loan to value, the bank might give you £150,000 straight into your bank account. In return, they're going to place a charge on the property, which means that they have legal right to take ownership of it if you stop making your payments, which I hope you won't do. You still own that property, but the lender then have kind of security over it. Now, if you've already have a mortgage, you'll need to find out something called a redemption figure, which is basically the amount that you still owe to the original lender. Now, you can usually find this out by logging into your mortgage account or by calling your lender. And then when you remortgage, the new mortgage pays off the old mortgage. And of course, the difference, as you now realize, of course, goes straight to you. So, one more example. If the property is valued at, say, £200,000 and your redemption figure is £110,000, then a 75% loan to value mortgage would allow you to borrow £150,000, wouldn't it? The new lender pays off the original £110,000 mortgage from the £150,000, leaving you to walk away with the difference, which of course is £40,000. Less any fees, of course. And so, with that all cleared up, what I'd like to do now is to actually quickly run you through a step-by-step process of remortgaging. But before I do that, if you're finding this video in any way helpful, it would just be awesome if you could click on that like button, because it really helps our channel, if that's okay. So let me run you through this step-by-step process so you don't miss anything out. So, step 1 in the remortgaging process is to speak to your current lender, in my opinion, if you have one, naturally, because they might actually offer you a better deal to stay with them. Alternatively, if you already have a good mortgage broker, speak to them and they'll do this for you. Step 2. If you're not happy with their offer, which is, let's be honest, probably going to be the case. If you've got lots of other mortgage lenders out there, it's likely that there'll be a better deal out there, probably. Speak to an independent mortgage broker, if you don't already have one, who must have access to the whole of the market. That's so important. And by that, I mean they don't just kind of work for the Halifax or they don't just work for Santander. Because then, if they've got access to the whole of the market, they can then look across the whole of the market and find you the best possible deal. Step 3, your broker will then help you to choose a lender that suits your needs. Step 4. In most cases, you need a solicitor or a conveyancer, but in many cases, the lender offers a free legal work. That's part of the deal. And that's part of the reasons why some people go for certain types of mortgages, because it kind of just lessens their costs. Where this is the case, the lender appoints their own solicitor, and frankly, you don't need to do much. The mortgage broker doesn't do any of the legal work, as far as I'm aware, but they do, of course, help to kind of arrange everything and make sure that everything is in place properly. Step 5. The solicitor will then handle the legal work for both you and the lender. Step 6. If you are actually switching lenders, they'll likely send out a surveyor to value the property, but actually, in many cases, this might just literally be a drive-by to kind of make sure that there is indeed a property there and it's loosely what it's supposed to be. Again, that's not always the case, but that certainly has been the case with a couple that I've remortgaged recently. Step 7. The lender will run through some checks like a credit check, income verification, and proof of rent if you already have a portfolio. Once all of this is done and approved, the lender releases the funds. And to give you an idea of timescale, whilst they might say it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks, in reality, I'd expect the process to take probably double that, maybe a little bit longer in my experience, which can be so frustrating if you need that money for another deal. But sadly, that's just part of the slow process of remortgaging. So that's basically the entire process. But before I go, there's one really big tip. Maybe it's a little bit obvious to some people. There's one big tip that I wanted to share with you that's relevant to this. And that is, please, please, please don't remortgage without a clear purpose. There's absolutely no point putting the equity out of your property if the cash is just going to sit in the bank account slowly being eaten away by inflation. But if you've got a plan to reinvest that money wisely, say in another property or in some other venture, then remortgaging really can be a fantastic way to fund it, in my opinion. If you found this video helpful, it would just be awesome if you could click on that subscribe button. That way you won't miss out any of the future content that's going to be coming from us. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.